Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 1 to 4 player Expansion to Nature Climate, designed by Dominic Krapuschetz and published by North Star Game Studio, who helped sponsor this video. As a climate changes, animals need to migrate and adapt to survive. Climate is the 6th module for the game Nature, which this video assumes you already know how to play. If not, don't worry, I have a tutorial video for that, which you'll find linked in the description below, along with any of the other modules we have videos for. The various modules give you new ways to play and experience nature, and you can mix and match them as you like, but it's usually a good idea to play a module on its own before mixing others in. Here, we'll focus on the changes climate adds to the core game, so join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, follow all the steps from the core game of Nature, but use this climate watering hole instead of the regular one, and put this climate marker on the start space of this climate track at the top of the board, setting these climate dice nearby. Also shuffle the climate cards, which have this back, into a face-down deck beside the regular Nature cards, giving each person one of these climate player aids. And that's the setup. When using the climate module, along with the other new elements it adds to your game, which we'll go over in a moment, you'll now play 5 rounds instead of the usual 4. Also, at the start of the preparation phase, instead of drawing a card to add food to the watering hole, you'll now have the starting player roll these dice. The symbols on this die will either show a sun to indicate that the climate marker will move to the left, or this frost symbol to indicate the marker moves to the right. You then move the marker, the number of spaces showing on this die, in that direction. This die has values from 1 to 6, so if we had just rolled a 3 and the sun, we would move the marker 3 spaces in this direction. If you would ever roll so that the marker would go past the end of the board, just move it to the final space on that end. Now check the value on the bottom row under the marker's current position, and add that number of plant tokens from the supply to the watering hole multiplied by your number of players. So in a 2-player game, that would be 5 times 2, which is 10. If you want, there's a variant rule you can use instead, where the starting player decides the direction the marker will move in rather than roll this die. And then they roll just this die to see how many spaces the marker advances in their chosen direction. With this module, when it's your turn to draw 5 cards during the round, take them in any combination from the available decks: Nature, Climate, and/or any others you might be using from other modules. For example, if we had the Flight module in play as well, I might take 1 Nature, 3 Climate, and 1 Flight card. That said, you have to make the decision about what combination of cards you want and draw them before looking at any of them. So if I wanted 3 climate cards and 2 nature cards, I'd draw all of them first, and then I'd look at their faces. I should also mention, each deck will have its own discard pile, and if a deck ever runs out while playing, you shuffle its related discard pile into a new deck. In this module, the adapting phase comes with a new twist. A species has its maximum number of traits increased by 1. So if nothing else was affecting that number, a species could have 4 traits instead of the usual 3. The feeding phase also has a change. At the end of the feeding phase, each species will lose population equal to the climate level, which is shown on the row directly below the marker's current position. So while here, each species loses 4 population. However, a species reduces this loss based on its protection against heat if the marker is on this side of the tracker, or its protection against cold if the marker is on this side. Each species will have an amount of protection against heat and cold based on its size, as shown here on your climate player aid. For example, if the species has a size of 2, it would have 2 cold protection and 3 heat protection. But if its size is 4 or higher, it has 4 cold protection and 1 heat protection. A species also gains additional heat and cold protection from related symbols found on their traits. As an example, these are the symbols that represent heat protection, while these symbols represent cold protection. So if we had a species that gains 2 heat protection from this trait, and then 1 more based on its size, that's a total of 3 heat protection against a climate heat of 4. So it would lose 1 population at the end of the feeding phase. However, if its size was 3 or less, it would then have more than enough heat protection to meet the current heat threat level, and it wouldn't lose any population. After checking for losses due to the climate level, you would then move on to scoring. But now let's take a look at a change related to resolving extinction. Normally, an extinct species carries over its size into the next round. But when using the climate module, instead of keeping the size dial, you draw a number of traits equal to its value from any combination of decks you're using, and then the dial is discarded. So if this species of ours went extinct, as usual, its traits would go back into our hand, and any killed tokens would go by our screen. But then we'd check the value on its size dial and draw that number of cards from the deck, returning this dial to the supply after. With that, we've covered the rules of the climate module, which are also shown here on your player aid. So now, let's learn about the new traits this module comes with. First up, we have long neck. A species with this trait eats 1 additional plant token from the supply each time it forages from the watering hole. To see this in action, let's pretend we had a size 1 species with 2 long neck traits and the social trait which provides +2 food when eating. When the species forages, it eats 1 plant from the watering hole for its size, and then 2 more because of the social trait. Then, after that foraging, the long neck trait lets it eat again. But now it takes 1 plant from the supply. Since this is a separate eating from the initial forage, the social trait resolves again, giving the player 2 more food tokens, which they would now take from the supply as well. Each long neck you have resolves separately, so this one would allow you to eat again, triggering social with it, which would then provide you with 3 more food taken from the supply. Next, we have seasonal migration. When you have a species with this trait, once per round, you can resolve its effect by discarding any 1 card in your hand. And then instead of foraging from the watering hole, that species forages twice from the supply. And you count each of those as separate forages. So if our species had 2 seasonal migrations and 1 social trait, we might use the effect here to discard a trait from our hand and allow our species to forage from the supply twice. The first time it forages, it would gain 2 food because of its size, and then 2 more food from the supply due to the social trait. Then this trait would cause it to forage again, gaining 2 more food because of its size, and 2 more because of the social trait. Although seasonal migration can only be resolved once per round, if your species has multiple copies, each of them can be resolved once during the round. So now, or on a future turn, I could also resolve this one. Here we have the Nocturnal trait. A species with this can only be hunted by another species that also has the Nocturnal trait. And be aware, no matter how many copies of Nocturnal your species has, if the other species has at least 1 Nocturnal trait, it can hunt you. Here we have a trait that prevents a species with it from being hunted by any species with a lower population. So here, normally this species could hunt this one, since this has the hunter trait and an equal or higher hunt value than this species' defense value. But if this had the defensive herder trait, it could not be hunted by this species, since this one has a lower population. Burrowing is another trait that affects hunters. Here, a species cannot be hunted by a larger species unless that larger hunter has the clawed trait. In this example, the hunter here has an equal or higher hunt value compared to this species' defense, so this could be targeted by this hunter. But if the target had this burrowing trait, now it cannot be hunted by a species that is larger like this one is. On the other hand, if this hunter had the clawed trait, that causes this effect to be ignored, so now this species could hunt this one. Here's a unique trait. When the climate marker is in the frigid or ice age zone, a species with this trait gains +3 to its hunt value. So this trait is active as long as the marker is anywhere within these spaces of the climate track. This trait introduces the concept of storing food on it. It tells us that when its species eats, it may store 1 food token here. This means that once its related species is fully fed, you can still treat it as hungry if you wish, and add food tokens to the trait itself. That represents storing the food there. As long as a trait has capacity to store food, its species can be considered hungry if the player wants. The capacity to store food on this trait is 1 token. So once all its population tokens have food and 1 is stored here, it can no longer be treated as hungry and cannot eat anymore. As it says on this trait, once a food token has been stored here, that species gains 4 cold and 4 heat protection. However, after the scoring phase, you discard the token it had stored. All right, the final trait with this module is called underground hoarding. Once a species with this trait is fully fed, meaning it has food on all of its population tokens, it may then store extra food on this trait up to its total population. As long as underground hoarding has available storage, its controlling player may choose to treat that species as hungry if they want. As an example, since this species has a population of 3, once it's fully fed, it can continue to be treated as hungry and store up to 3 food on its trait when eating. Food stored and left on underground hoarding will stay there from round to round. This is valuable because as a feeding action, instead of foraging or hunting, a species with this trait may move food stored here to its hungry population. And when you do this, you must move as much food as possible from the storage. So in a case like this, we'd have to move 2 food. Now, on a future turn in this feeding phase, since the trait now has room in its storage, we could treat this species as hungry to have it eat again to add additional food here from a valid source. That said, any food on this trait is not scored at the end of the game. Also, if this species would lose population, you do not have to remove food from its trait, even if it has more food than its storage capacity. However, once it has less food than its new capacity, it cannot gain more than its current storage limit. So here, it can store at most 1 food now. Also, if this trait is discarded from a species, any food on it is returned to the supply. And those are all the traits which you'll find summarized inside your player aid. If you have the Arctic Tundra or Sahara Desert modules, you'll find rules about how they interact with the climate module here. And on the back of the rules, you'll find some answers to questions related to how climate works with other modules. This module also comes with components and rules for solo play, and depending on which printing you have, you may also find a promotional trait to add into your game. But those elements I'll leave for you to discover on your own. Otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play the climate module for nature. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime I post a new video. And if you'd like to support the channel directly, you can join the Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.